Well, Ledger. It looks like you are having a very bad day. That's because you forgot that we only ever cared about you having one job. Don't upload the seed phrase anywhere, even in encrypted shards. Ready? Let's go. Today, we are going to discuss the very controversial new Ledger Recover functionality, why this isn't just hysteria caused by a misunderstanding of cryptography, and how the additional attack vectors may not matter that much to you and your ADA. If you already knew that today's thumbnail would be an image of fiery burning ledgers, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the biggest PR blunder in the history of crypto. The people over at Trezor are going to be popping bottles tonight because the biggest player in their space, Ledger, just unloaded a truckload of fail like the world of magic internet monies has never seen before. It all started this morning with this. Ledger posted, exciting update. Oh, Ledger, you had no idea how exciting this was going to be for you. Exciting update. Ledger has a new product, Ledger Recover, that's launching soon. Here's what Ledger Recover is and what it isn't. And then they have a nice little thread for you telling you all about Ledger Recover. It sounds innocent enough. Who doesn't want to recover? If you trip on some stairs, what do you want? The only thing in the world you want is to recover from tripping on the stairs. If you were to lose all your crypto, same thing. The only thing in the world you would want is to recover your crypto. So probably a decent enough name, except this is crypto. In crypto, we know that when people talk about recovering your crypto, recovering an account, recovering a wallet, the first thought that comes to our mind is, wait a second, are you going to inject some trust? Are you going to make a trustless, permissionless system into a system where I have to trust you? Do you want me to trust you? Because we all remember a couple of years ago when you lost all of our contact info in that hack. Granted, no seed phrases were hacked from Ledger. There's nothing like that that's gone on, but they did have, I guess it was some kind of marketing list with all of our names and I think other information like addresses on it. I think that was the information that was hacked previously by Ledger. So trust isn't exactly something we want to put in any company, let alone one that's already been hacked in the past. I'm sure Ledger would prefer that we say data breach as opposed to hack, but come on, it's all the same to us because now our addresses and names, if I'm remembering the right lost information, is out in the wild. That's exactly the information we didn't want out in the wild. But anyways, here's the thread. So if you read the thread, it all sounds okay at first. Self-custody is at the core of our offering. Okay, great. Your secret recovery phrase is securely generated on your device. Okay, great. We have no access to it. Like that. This will never change. Great. Ledger Recovery is an optional subscription for users who want a backup of their secret recovery phrase. Okay, great. How does this work though? So they say, but first and foremost, how is your secret recovery phrase generated? Ledger uses the BIP39 standard for the generation of the secret recovery phrase on all of our devices. This is generated by the secure element of your device and is only ever shared with you, never us. More here, okay? If you choose to subscribe, Ledger Recovery encrypts a version of your private key and splits it into 3 fragments using Shamir's secret sharing. All of this happens on the secure element chip, so your secret recovery phrase is not at risk. You're like, okay. So if you've been around crypto for a long time, you might know what Shamir's secret sharing is, and it's, not a terrible system. But then they say these encrypted fragments are stored by 3 different parties on cryptographically secure hardware security modules. And this is where everybody freaked out. All of a sudden, there was a gigantic amount of outrage. People were not a little angry. People were extremely angry. And Ledger started taking all kinds of fire across Twitter because the whole job of a hardware wallet is to protect your seed phrase, to never, ever upload your seed phrase anywhere, not to send it to any trusted third party, not even to send encrypted fragments encrypted shards of your seed phrase to any trusted parties at all. That's the end of the story. That's the whole job of the hardware wallet, at least for all of us in crypto. We don't want the hardware wallet to ever transmit any version of the seed phrase anywhere. And this is where things got a little confusing for everybody. Because if you understand how encryption actually works, you understand that your hardware wallet, your ledger, has always sent a version of your private key outside of the hardware wallet. So why do I say that? That sounds wild and unexpected to some people. They honestly believe that the whole purpose of the hardware wallet is to protect your key and never upload your key anywhere. And that is true. It does protect your private key and never upload it anywhere. But the thing you have to understand is that in crypto, your private key is used to produce some other things that we do share outside of the hardware wallet. In fact, we share them freely all the time. So here's a chapter out of Mastering Bitcoin by Andreas Antonopoulos. And this has one of the best little infographics to explain what I'm talking about right here. So this is figure 4.1 from that book, which explains the formula to produce your public address in Bitcoin. We're using the Bitcoin example because Cardano is a little bit more complicated. We have some different types of addresses and things, but the Bitcoin example kind of explains this point well. So if you imagine that K is your private key, this is starting with a private key in the form of a randomly generated number. This is lowercase k. We multiply it by a predetermined point on the curve called the generator point G. So lowercase k multiplied by G. G is just a point on this elliptic curve, right? So this little formula is the formula that is used to generate your corresponding public key K. So think about that for a second. Your public key is produced from your private key in Bitcoin. This is something that I think maybe not most of us, but if you tried to understand it, you would have understood this in the early days of Bitcoin. This is just the way private public key pairs work. Your public key is produced from your private key. And you probably understand that your ledger, it does things like tell you what your public key is, and then you freely share that out to the world. So all along, if you've been, allowing people to send you things or using your public address in crypto that, is attached to your wallet, that is your ledger hardware wallet, you've been doing this thing. So the way it works, we use elliptic curve multiplication, as Andreas puts it, to go from the private key to the public key. And then there's a hashing algorithm that produces the actual Bitcoin address. So if you've used Bitcoin or pretty much any other crypto with your hardware wallet, you've been doing something like this. You've been exporting your private key in the form of eventually your address, your public address. You've probably been doing that all along. And this really confused people today because this isn't the problem. And this isn't exactly what's going on. So this is an important distinction that a lot of people got confused about earlier today when the debates were raging about Ledger and this evil new functionality they'd created. But the best way to explain it is probably with this. So here's a retweet from the CEO of Ledger, who we'll talk about later in the context of the live stream that he did. This is the CEO of Ledger, Pascal Gauthier, and he's retweeting this. He says, sharing encrypted secrets is a basic function of a hardware wallet, which is true, but I'm going to show you why it seems there's a lot more than that going on here. So the thing he's retweeting is this. This poster said, I don't want to be rude, but do you guys understand how asymmetric encryption works? Laugh out loud. It doesn't matter if encrypted data is shared. No one can read it other than the private key owner. You guys know that your public ETH address is also a hash of your private key. That this is the same phenomenon that I just showed you in the Andreas Antonopoulos book about Bitcoin. The public address is often the result of some encryption and hashing of the private key. So here's the problem. So he has this post trying to explain to people like, no, no one can encrypt it. By the logic that you aren't okay with the encrypted version of your seed being shared, would you also not be okay with your public address being shared? Laugh out loud. In fact, the fact that they shared a shard of the encrypted payload makes it even safer. No single point of failure. There seems to be a problem with this. But a lot of posters who seem to be conveying that same kind of sentiment today were making a serious mistake. So here's what they seem to be assuming. They seem to be assuming that you would use your private key to encrypt those shards, those fragments, those 3 fragments that you're sending off to these 3 trusted custodians. And then if you ever needed to recover your private key, they would send those fragments back to you, and then you would use your private key to decrypt the shards so you could reconstruct your private key. You already see the problem, right? How could you decrypt your shards to reconstruct your private key with your private key if you lost your private key? Because the only reason you would need to use this recover service is if you didn't have access to your private key. So you couldn't possibly be using your private key to decrypt the shards, which means it can't have been your private key which originally encrypted the shards. You see the problem here, right? And this is sort of proved out in the Ledger Recover FAQs that they published just today. So if you go down here to the bottom of the FAQs, they explain what's going on here. What if I lose my Ledger device that is associated with my Ledger Recover subscription? Simply get another Ledger device and follow the process to recover access to your wallet. Do I need a new Ledger Nano X to recover access to my wallet? No, you don't need to purchase a new device or perform a device reset. The only necessary step is to update your Nano X to the latest firmware version available. How can I recover access to my wallet? Get a new Ledger Nano X. So you can see just from this FAQ that you can recover your private key from a brand new Ledger Nano X. That means you're not using any private key that may have been generated on your old ledger. This certainly works if you lose your ledger. If you totally lose your ledger and you don't have access to your private key anymore, you can still recover your private key. That means it's not your private key that's being used to encrypt those shards originally. It's a different private key. So going back to this thread where the guy was like, I don't mean to be rude, but do you guys understand how asymmetric encryption works? Laugh out loud. And mind you, when we look at this person's profile, they say they're a CTO by day, trader by night, ex-hedge fund, built tech infrastructure for most Web3 companies you know. Wow. So if we scroll down here in the comments, people started figuring this out though. Check this out. If we come down here, this poster was smart enough to ask, if the encrypted data cannot be read by people other than the private key owner, how can it then be recovered if you lose the private key? This makes no sense. Exactly. And he got a response to this from someone who hadn't read the FAQ. This person said, I think if I am understanding this correctly, this requires the original device. It doesn't, because we just read that in the FAQ. In fact, you are almost encouraged to get a brand new Ledger Nano X. That means they're not using your original private key. And someone else down here figured this out. They said, your logic is flawed. The service is meant for if you lose access to your private key, so you don't have it anymore. So in order to decrypt it for you to restore it, someone or something else must have it. So you do share encrypted data, but the key to decrypt it is out there. Obviously, this is the case. If you don't have to use your original device to decrypt those encrypted shards that you sent, those 3 encrypted shards that you sent out to the 3 trusted custodians, if you don't have to use your original device, that means the private key to decrypt those is not coming from your original device. Someone else has that private key. So if those shards are out there with those trusted custodians, and your private key is out there somewhere too, that means that if those encrypted shards, and I believe it's just 2 out of the 3, if 2 out of the 3 encrypted shards get compromised, and this private key, the location of which has not been identified as far as I know, that private key gets compromised, boom, poof, there goes all your crypto. If you want more verification that that's how this works, here's the Ledger Recover landing page. Recover your keys using your identity. It says, lose your Ledger device and don't have your secret recovery phrase with you? Spelled your secret recovery phrase wrong? Broke your Ledger device and don't have your secret recovery phrase with you? Your recovery sheet got destroyed? So they're letting you know your secret recovery phrase isn't legible. So all the different ways you could get locked out of your wallet. With Ledger Recover, you'll never get locked out of your wallet. How does that work? Ledger Recover backs up your secret recovery phrase and links it to your identity. Yes, they're going to have you KYC. They say the backup for your secret recovery phrase is linked to your verified identity. This is KYC. The backup is fragmented into 3 pieces. Each of the encrypted fragments is secured independently by Ledger, CoinCover, and a third provider. And during the live stream, they actually said who the third provider was. I didn't recognize the name necessarily, if I understood it correctly. So how to set it up, they talk about how you can KYC here, and then how do you recover? Connect your Ledger Nano X and confirm your personal details on FIDO and electronic identification. The ID verification providers will guide you in verifying your identity. The backup for your secret recovery phrase is restored on your Ledger Nano X. So it's KYC. You can just restore your seed phrase by using the KYC credentials you provided when you first signed up for Ledger Recover. And we know that KYC can create new attack vectors. We know that because Ledger told us that today in the live stream. So here was the Twitter space from today. It included Pascal Gauthier, the chairman and CEO of Ledger, Charles Guillemet, the CTO of Ledger, Nico Baca, who apparently is the VP of the Innovation Lab at Ledger, and Ian Rogers of Ledger, who kind of acted as the moderator. So some of the most interesting details came out of Nico Baca. He said, and this relates back to what we were just talking about, he said this, and I'm going to be paraphrasing very liberally here, so you should go back and listen to this yourself. You shouldn't rely on my recollection, but I'm going to try to do my best. He said, when I am saying, and technical people are saying, there is not an additional attack vector, we are strictly talking about the device. Of course, if you add KYC in between, it will add new attack vectors, because typically there are ways to fool KYCs. And that's also why the insurance goes to 50K and not to 3 million or whatever. This definitely adds new attack vectors. So you have to think if you are comfortable with the KYC. And at one point, he even mentioned that he himself is not a KYC guy. So he was giving it to a very straightforward guy, this Nico Baca, apparently based on this Twitter space. But it's interesting here. He's saying, and apparently there's some kind of insurance related to Ledger Recover. And what he's saying is there's a reason it goes to 50K and not to 3 million. That's because this whole system where you can recover your seed phrase using KYC information, it does add new attack vectors. There's ways that whole system can be fooled. And he's straight up telling you that. So there are new attack vectors added if you enable this Ledger Recover functionality on your Ledger device. But he also said something during this live stream, Nico Baca again, he said something that maybe, makes me think that maybe some of you won't care. And here's why. He was talking about the parameters of the firmware interacting with the seed. He mentioned the seed sits on the secure element in your ledger. I believe he called it a smart card, but he was obviously referring to the secure element in your ledger. He said, the seed sits on the secure element in your ledger, but we need to manipulate the seed to send transactions and things like that. So the firmware is actually always touching the seed. It's like constantly having to touch the seed to do all these things, like send, your ADA. Send your ADA to some other account. But access to the seed is always gated. So the seed is never accessed unless you give your consent. And here's why I think some people won't care about this Ledger Recover thing once they think about it. So Ledger Recover obviously does add some new attack vectors if you enable it. And I think all of us in crypto, myself included, would agree we would rather that Ledger not do this. It's like, hey, Ledger, please don't do this. That was kind of a lot of the sentiment that was, fired very vociferously at Ledger today. We were all basically begging Ledger, please don't do this. You're going to make us all very angry and trust you much, much less. But Nico Baca does make a good point. It's like, the firmware is always doing things with your seed. Like we talked about, your private key is used to produce, eventually it's used, it's through processes of hashing and encryption. It's used to produce your public address, which you use all the time in crypto. So we're always constantly doing things with the seed. And in a ledger device, what he's saying is that access to that seed by the firmware is always gated. You always have to consent to it. So in order for these three encrypted fragments to be generated, you have to consent to it. So when we consent to a transaction, we have to actually push that button on the ledger. And he's saying, hey, you're already consenting to us doing things with your seed phrase when you push that button and you send transactions out. This is no different. The only way those three encrypted fragments get created, they get generated, is if you push the button. So the only attack vector here is the same as it was before. If somebody tricks you into pushing that button on your ledger, then yeah, sure, they can get you to do things with the seed. They can get the firmware to do things with the seed that you don't want it to. But that's the same as for transactions. If somebody tricks you into pushing the button saying that you're going to send them all of your ADA, that's bad, and it could happen. People do get tricked into pushing that button and sending their crypto to places they don't want. And theoretically, you could come up with some kind of an attack vector where somebody tricks you into consenting to the generation of the encrypted fragments, and then those encrypted fragments go out to the custodians, and then they somehow trick you also into providing KYC documentation to those custodians, and then they or they provide fake, KYC documentation to the custodians, and then they, get your seed by, again, tricking the custodians, fooling the KYC process, and somehow they get the, 2 out of the 3 encrypted shards, and they can reconstitute your seed phrase on a new ledger or something like that. But if you think about it, that's a lot of steps. It'd be much easier for them to just trick you into sending them your ADA, sending them your crypto. That happens all the time in crypto. A lot of scams where people make you think you're sending, like a small amount of crypto, and actually they're tricking you into sending all of your crypto, and you don't pay attention to what you're pushing the button for on your ledger, something like that. These kinds of things, sure, they could happen, but it's kind of the same attack vector as it was before. Sure, if they trick you into pushing the button, you could, accidentally, I guess, you could be tricked into consenting to this ledger recover thing, and then they could then execute on the new attack vectors that are involved with the KYC end of all this. But it's actually seems like a more complicated attack than them just doing what they would try to do now, which is get you to consent to a transaction to send all of your crypto to them. So at the end of the day, I think Nico Baca might be right. If you don't willingly consent to enabling this ledger recover functionality on your device, the attack is, kind of the same as it's always been. But having said that, like I said, I think this is kind of a step backwards. Like, I don't think any of us really want for our ledger devices to even have this capability. We don't even want our ledger device to be able to send any encrypted fragments of our seed phrase. We don't want our ledger device to do anything with our seed phrase. We just want it to stay on that secure element. We don't want any of this functionality. So why is Ledger doing this? Well, like the CEO of Ledger said, they're thinking about their future customers. So here's the problem. I'm going to start speculating here. So this is just my unfounded speculation. But Ledger has a problem in that they don't have recurring revenue. They sell you a Ledger device and you just use it forever, and you basically probably never pay them again. That's not what companies want these days. They want recurring revenue. And I believe that's where this ledger recover thing is coming from, obviously. When corporations do things, it's to increase the amount of money they're making, right? I think it's the same with this ledger recover thing. A company like Ledger, they sell you a hardware device that in the grand scheme of things doesn't really cost that much. It's not that much revenue to them. And then they never get to make any more money off you. So here they've created a recurring revenue mechanism so they can get $10 out of everybody every month. That's why they're doing this. And they also think it might onboard more mainstream people. Like, I think throughout this live stream, who was it? Charles Guillemet maybe was saying that, his mother, probably wouldn't trust herself, maybe wouldn't trust herself to keep track of her private key. Maybe she'd be too afraid to use a ledger device because she might lose her seed phrase. So he's like, this is a good solution for her. For you diehard crypto guys, this is probably not something you want to use. This is meant to onboard the people who don't trust themselves to keep track of their seed phrase. And Ledger probably has a good point there. They probably will onboard some people with this new functionality that wouldn't have onboarded to crypto previously. And they point out this is probably better than the exchanges. This is a much more secure way to store your crypto than if you're just keeping it on Coinbase or Binance or Kraken or something like that. I agree. This is better than keeping your crypto on one of those exchanges. But at the same time, is this anything that any of us who are actually in crypto and are concerned about these issues, is this anything we're ever going to use? No, probably not. For us, from our perspective, this is a step backwards. We don't want Ledger to do this. We don't want this functionality anywhere near our devices. But based on what the CEO of Ledger said today, I don't think they care about us. Like he said, this isn't something for our current customers. He said, this is what our future customers want. So many people have asked for it. That trumps all the negative comments on Twitter. He's basically saying the needs of his future customers trump the needs of his current and past customers. And that's not what you want to hear if you're one of us diehard crypto people who are among those former and current customers. Finally, this may be extremely bad timing for one very prominent Cardano NFT project. So Ledger just posted this yesterday. For our next custom nano collab, we're doing things the Clay way. Can you guess who it's with? Hashtag Cardano coming soon. Champ Medici. This is pretty bad timing. Like the day before the biggest fiasco in the history of the company, it's announced that you're partnering with that company who otherwise would be a great partnership. Maybe still a great partnership, but terrible timing. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.